From the man who bankrolled Voldemort's first rise, to the professor who made students curse each other for homework, to the woman who tortured children and signed the paperwork after, Voldemort died at Hogwarts. His followers mostly didn't. Some went to Azkaban. Some vanished before the dust settled. And at least one of them, someone who caused more sustained damage than half the Death Eater inner circle combined, walked away with barely a scratch. Today we're tracking every surviving Death Eater, what they did, what happened to them, and whether the Wizarding World's justice system was up to the task. But one of them received a punishment so light it bordered on a career holiday. Which Death Eater came closest to getting away with all of it? And how? Lucius Malfoy, the man who spent 30 years making sure his hair looked better than his conscience. Lucius bankrolled Voldemort's first rise to power, handed a Horcrux to an 11-year-old girl, and when the Dark Lord returned, welcomed him into Malfoy Manor like an extremely dangerous house guest who refused to leave. He was, for most of the series, the most visible face of Death Eater respectability, the one who proved you could serve the darkest wizard in history and still get invited to the right ministry dinners. After the battle, Lucius did not go to Azkaban. The reason is uncomfortable, but entirely believable. He cooperated. He named names. He handed over intelligence on Death Eater activity that the Auror Office couldn't have obtained any other way. In the Wizarding world, information has always been its own form of currency, and Lucius had 30 years of receipts. The Malfoy fortune survived. The manor survived. What didn't survive was the influence. The family that once whispered in ministers' ears found itself quietly uninvited from every room that mattered. No trials to fund, no causes to back, no Dark Lords on the horizon to attach themselves to. For a man who defined himself entirely through power and status, enforced irrelevance was its own punishment. Narcissa fared slightly better. Her decision in the Forbidden Forest, telling Voldemort that Harry was dead when she knew otherwise, was understood to be the moment the war turned. It didn't earn her a ceremony, but it earned her a lenient hearing, which in the post-war ministry was arguably worth more. The Malfoys survived, diminished, humiliated, and suddenly very interested in keeping a low profile. Voldemort really does ruin everything he touches. If walking free counts as getting off lightly, the next entry involves someone who barely had to try. Draco Malfoy. He didn't kill Dumbledore. He lowered his wand on the astronomy tower. He refused, twice, to confirm Harry's identity at Malfoy Manor, a hesitation that bought time and almost certainly saved lives. None of that erased what he'd done in the year leading up to it. But in a post-war inquiry trying to separate true believers from coerced participants, Draco occupied complicated enough ground that the ministry chose not to press charges. He was not imprisoned. He eventually married Astoria Greengrass, from a family that had quietly refused to raise their children in the old ideology, and had a son named Scorpius. By most accounts, he spent the remainder of his life trying to be a different kind of Malfoy. Whether he managed it is something reasonable people still disagree on. What's certain is that Draco was the only person to receive the Dark Mark and never face formal consequences for it. That is either a story about redemption or a story about privilege, depending on which family you were born into. Drop your take in the comments, because the question of whether Draco deserved to walk free is one the Wizarding world has never fully settled. Draco at least showed hesitation. The next two entries had none. Amicus and Alecto Carrow. Hogwarts' two worst teachers in a school that once employed Gilderoy Lockhart. That is a competitive field. Amicus took over Defense Against the Dark Arts and immediately rebranded it Dark Arts, removing the defense part as apparently optional. Alecto taught Muggle studies, where lessons consisted largely of explaining that Muggles were subhuman. Between them, they ran Hogwarts as a regime. Students who broke rules were sent to Amicus for detention, which, in practice, meant being forced to practice the Cruciatus Curse on fellow pupils. For marks. Here's where the post-war story gets interesting. During the Battle of Hogwarts, both Carrows were bound and incapacitated in Ravenclaw Tower. They never made it to the main fight, which sounds like a clean ending, except being tied up in a tower during a siege is not the same as being in Auror custody at the end of one. Whether the Aurors collected them or found an empty room is one of those questions that never received an official answer. Some silences in ministry records are administrative. Others are something else entirely. The Carrows were dangerous because they were obedient. Augustus Rookwood was dangerous because he was brilliant. Augustus Rookwood. Before Voldemort got hold of him, Rookwood was an unspeakable. The title is not ceremonial. The Department of Mysteries houses rooms dedicated to the study of death, time, love, space, and thought. The people who work there are called unspeakables because they are formally prohibited from discussing their research with anyone outside the department. Not discouraged, prohibited. Rookwood spent his career 2 floors from the Minister of Magic, studying things the Ministry didn't want the public to know existed. His value to the Death Eaters wasn't his wand. It was his access. For years, he fed intelligence from inside the Ministry, helping Voldemort acquire the prophecy, and contributing research that almost certainly informed the Dark Lord's obsessive interest in defeating death. He was eventually exposed, imprisoned in Azkaban, and broken out during the mass escape of 1996. He arrived at the Battle of Hogwarts as one of the older and more knowledgeable members of the Inner Circle. He was stunned by Aberforth Dumbledore during the battle, which placed him, theoretically, in Ministry custody when it ended. What nobody has ever fully accounted for is what an unspeakable knows that doesn't appear in any official record. 2 decades in the Time Room and the Death Chamber leaves a particular kind of mark on a person's understanding of what's possible. Whether Rookwood ended up in Azkaban or simply ceased to appear in records is a distinction the post-war Ministry never publicly clarified. Knowing what he knew, that ambiguity feels deliberate. Rookwood understood the machinery of power. Fenrir Greyback just wanted to watch it burn. Technically not a Death Eater, practically the most prolific attacker in the entire war, Greyback never took the Dark Mark. He and Voldemort had aligned interests, dismantling the existing Wizarding Order. But Fenrir was operating his own agenda alongside the Death Eaters, not underneath them. His goal was an army, a werewolf population large enough to overwhelm the Ministry, built by infecting as many people as possible. He preferred children. He thought they turned more completely. During the Battle of Hogwarts, Greyback was beaten back by Ron Weasley and Neville Longbottom, 2 people he would have found laughable a year earlier. Whether he was captured or simply driven off in the chaos is one of the more conspicuous silences in the post-war record. Here's why that silence matters. Lycanthropy doesn't end with a battle. Every full moon is a potential recruitment. A werewolf with Greyback's experience and motivation, operating in regions where Ministry oversight doesn't reach, doesn't need infrastructure. He needs time and a clear night. The post-war wizarding world began pushing for werewolf rights, a direct reversal of the prejudice that radicalized Greyback in the first place. Whether that progress reached him, or whether it simply made him harder to track, the Ministry has never publicly confirmed his capture or his death. For the most prolific biter in wizarding history, that is a remarkable loose end. Greyback operated at the edges of the Death Eater structure. Corban Yaxley ran it from the inside. Corban Yaxley, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and the reason Voldemort didn't need to storm the Ministry. He just had to wait for Yaxley to open the door. Yaxley placed the Imperius Curse on Pius Thickness, the Minister for Magic, and handed Voldemort control of the British wizarding government without a single public confrontation. The entire coup happened quietly, legally on paper, and with almost no visible disruption to the Ministry's daily operations. Dark wizardry as administrative procedure. Voldemort must have been delighted. During the Battle of Hogwarts, Yaxley was present, and then the records get thin. He wasn't killed in a named duel. He wasn't described being captured. He was simply there, and then the battle ended, and the post-war inquiry began, and Yaxley's specific fate never received a clean public resolution. For a man who spent his career understanding how institutional oversight works, and more importantly, how it fails, that ambiguity is hard to read as accidental. He would have known which records to suppress, which officials owed him a quiet favor, and how a well-positioned wizard makes himself difficult to prosecute without making himself obvious. Whether the new Ministry caught Yaxley, or simply found it complicated to try, has never received a satisfying answer, which, if you spent any time thinking about how the Ministry of Magic actually operates, is perhaps not surprising. Yaxley made himself useful to the system. The next entry was simply on the Ministry's payroll. Walden Macnair, executioner, Ministry employee, Death Eater. Simultaneously, for over a decade, all 3. While other Death Eaters operated underground or undercover, Macnair held an officially sanctioned Ministry position, Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures, and collected a ministerial salary throughout the years between Voldemort's first fall and his return. He attended Ministry functions. He filed reports. He was, on paper, a civil servant. His most visible moment in the series is the scheduled execution of Buckbeak in Prisoner of Azkaban, a moment that served Death Eater interests quietly, designed to cause pain to Hagrid and, at a remove, to Harry's world. That Macnair turned up to the execution with an axe and what can only be described as enthusiasm says something about the man. Macnair was present at the Battle of Hogwarts among the Death Eater forces. His specific fate in the aftermath was never publicly confirmed. What makes Macnair significant in a post-war context isn't Macnair himself, it's what he represents. If a ministry executioner could maintain dual loyalty for 15 years without exposure, the rot in the wizarding government ran considerably deeper than removing a handful of named Death Eaters would fix. Macnair is proof of concept that the problem was structural. The post-war ministry understood this, at least in theory. Whether the reforms that followed actually addressed it is a separate and considerably longer conversation. The foot soldiers of the Death Eaters mostly vanished. The woman who served Voldemort without ever joining them barely had to try. Dolores Umbridge. She never took the Dark Mark. She never stood in Voldemort's inner circle. She was, by every formal measure, a ministry official doing her job. She also ran a torture program targeting students, presided over tribunals that sentenced Muggle-born witches and wizards to Azkaban for the crime of existing, and used the instruments of legitimate institutional authority to do more sustained damage to the wizarding world than most of Voldemort's actual inner circle managed. Umbridge was arrested after the war. She was charged with the torture, false imprisonment, and, in a number of cases, the indirect deaths of Muggle-born witches and wizards whose sentences she had personally signed. She was tried, she was convicted, she went to Azkaban. Here's the part that deserves more attention than it usually gets. Umbridge didn't operate outside the system. She operated through it. Every detention form filed, every tribunal held in proper order, every sentence handed down with official documentation. She turned bureaucracy into a weapon and wielded it with a smile, a cardigan, and a collection of decorative plates featuring kittens. She wasn't a dark wizard who went rogue. She was a true believer in her own authority, so thoroughly convinced of her own righteousness that genuine evil felt, to her, like responsible governance. And the Ministry of Magic, built on exactly the kind of procedural compliance that rewards that personality type, handed her the tools to do it. Voldemort needed followers. Umbridge needed paperwork. She was, in some ways, the more unsettling of the two, because the wizarding world produced her entirely on its own. She ended up in Azkaban. The kittens presumably survived. The Death Eaters were shaped by the world that made them, which raises the question of what world Harry himself was shaped by. What if every other character raised Harry Potter? Because the boy who stopped all of them might never have existed at all.